All right, hopefully now you have mastered the difference between perfect intervals and augmented and diminished perfect intervals. That would be the augmented and diminished fourths, fifths, octaves, and unisons. Now what we're going to talk about is how we can alter those major intervals. How are we going to change up those seconds and thirds and sixths and sevenths? Now, it works really the same way as when we adjusted perfect into diminished and into augmented. The only difference is that major intervals have one other option. Because really fourths could only be three things. They're either perfect, or if they were smaller, they were diminished. If they were larger, they were augmented. Major intervals, though, have one extra little interval that they can be called, which is minor. All right? But again, it works the exact same way. So let's just start off with a third right here, and hopefully you can even look at that and tell me that that is a major third. And since that's the only kind we've learned up until now, you might know that. But this right here is my major third. To have a minor interval from a major interval, all that it means is that it is a half step smaller. Kind of like how when perfect got a half step smaller, it became diminished. But the difference is that major intervals first become minor. Okay, so major goes to minor. So to make this one minor, and let's adjust that top note, I'm just going to put a flat on there. And instead of it being a capital M, you need to have a lowercase m. And you need to be really clear and careful in your writing so that I can tell the difference and you don't get stuff marked wrong. Sometimes I have my students put a little line over their M, over the lowercase ones, so that I know that that's minor. So from major, when it becomes a half step smaller, it's called minor, okay? Now, from there, if this minor interval becomes yet another half step smaller, so if I put a double flat on there now, it's not minor anymore. Now it's actually a diminished third. Okay, so major intervals can get smaller by 2 half steps, basically. I guess you could think of it like that as far as our terminology goes. When a major interval becomes larger, it's called the same thing as what we did in the last video. So if we took that major third and we put a sharp on there and made it get larger, it's going to be an augmented third. So let me show you now all 4 types. So the home base we said was our major third. When we had a major third, it's just like we did last chapter. And remember, you've got to have that capital M. Make sure it's really clear. Now, I'm going to put my greater than less sign up there. Remember, when it gets bigger, we're always talking about in half steps. So here's an example of, what was it called when we got bigger by a half step? Augmented. You need to have an A in front of it. Augmented. It's A-U-G-M-E, augmented. So remember, it's getting bigger by a half step. Now there's 2 different smaller versions of the third beyond just the major. So the first one we talked about when it decreased in size by a half step was minor third. Remember, lowercase m. Put the little line over it if you're worried I might not be able to read your writing. Okay, next one, and the last one we have a double flat on there because we're getting decreasingly smaller. F to A flat became minor, F to A double flat became diminished third. So D3, diminished. All right? So those are the 4 different types of seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths that we can have. Perfects only had 3 different options. The seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths are going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 different options. So let's do some examples of these together, but really this is just a memorization thing. Make sure you know what that major interval is, and from there, decide whether is what I'm looking at bigger by a half step than major? Is it smaller by a half step? Or diminished would actually be smaller by 2 half steps than what the major is, okay? So let's practice. It's going to be fun. Make sure you have that stat paper. Do it with me. Pause it if you want to make sure you're doing it on your own before you see what I'm doing on the board here, and make sure that you're staying with me, all right? So let's do, my markers are dying. Let's do from A, and let's start off with just a major third, all right? So if you knew your key of A, go ahead and do your major third. Even if you don't, pause, do your major third. See if you're with me. If you knew your key of A, though, you'd have F, C, and G sharps. So you would know that that top note, my major third, would have a sharp on there. And if you didn't, remember, just do it this way. Major third is just whole step, whole step. So from your A, come back. From your A, you would go whole step, and that's a C sharp up there. Okay, so my major third is A to C sharp. Now, if I now want to change this to an augmented third, what am I going to do to that sharp up there? First of all, think about augmented. Am I trying to make this get larger or smaller than that major? Larger. So what am I going to do to that top note? I'm going to change it to a double sharp. Nice. I'm going to change it to a double sharp up there so that now it has gotten larger. Now, the other option would be, so that's my major. The other option would be, what could I do to that bottom note to make this an augmented third? If I sharp that bottom note, it actually is getting smaller, so it's getting minor actually. But what can I do to that bottom note? If I actually drop that bottom note down with a flat, I've done the exact same thing. It's really easier, I think, to just adjust the top note unless your directions ask you to change the bottom note, but again, it is possible to do it that way. All right, let's go back to our major third, and now let's change this to a minor third. What are we going to do to make this minor? If it already has a sharp on there, we need to make it minor. We have to decrease it by a half step. So what can I do? How about if I just take that away? Yepers, it's now become a minor third. It's been decreased in size by a half step. All right, how about if I need to make this diminished now? What am I going to do? How do I make that smaller even by a half step? Just changing the top note. I'm going to add a flat on there. Is that clear? So just think in terms of that chart that I drew out and look at the chart that I've uploaded and just remember the definition of augmented, major, and then going down to minor and then going to diminished, and I think you'll be fine. Now the hard thing to do, right now I'm taking you kind of a half step at a time. We were going from major and then we went to augmented, blah, blah, blah. What happens if right away you have to build a diminished interval or an augmented interval? How are you going to do that? So let's see, let's pick G as my starting note, and let's just say that the question asks you to build an augmented sixth. All right, the first step is going to be, like I said earlier, just to find your home base. So let's find what just a good old major sixth is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Think about either your key of G. Does the key of G have an E flat or sharp or anything in it? If you're not sure, do this. Whole, whole, half, whole, whole. Pause it. Unpause it. All right, it doesn't. So this actually is a major sixth. There's no flat or no sharp up there on that E. So now to make it augmented, what am I going to do to make that top note? What am I going to change that top note to make this? Well, wait, is augmented larger or smaller? Larger. All right, what am I going to do? Got to lift it up. So think about that. I'm going to sharp it. Okay, so again, I always just go to the major in my head and then think about the relative size as far as the interval goes. Now, how about if we were doing that same G starting note, but you were just told right away to do a diminished sixth? Okay, I would do it the same way, except you're kind of doing it in reverse because you're making it get smaller. So first, you can find that major sixth, which we found was an E, but then remember, diminished. Is diminished a half step smaller? It's not, because remember, that was minor. So major, when it gets smaller, goes to minor first, when it gets smaller by a half step, then it goes to diminished. So you've got to think to yourself, okay, major would be an E, minor would be E flat, diminished is then going to be E double flat. All right, and it works the same way, whether your top note, let's just do one. I was going to just tell you out loud, but let's do one where your top note has maybe a sharp on it already. So let's do from A, and let's do a major third first from A. Major third from A is going to be what? Think about, I think we did this a second ago anyway. It's going to be a C sharp. Now, if you needed to know not the major, what happens if you needed to know a diminished third from A? All right? So we just said out loud the major was A to C sharp. Now you've got to think, okay, if I need a diminished, am I decreasing this by a half step? That would be if it was minor. So if your major was A to C sharp, to make it minor, you brought it down to plain old C. And then to make it diminished, whoa, you might think, oh, I'm on B. So you know what? My answer is A to B. Is that right? It's the right note on the piano, but it's not right because that right there is a second, okay? So you've got to call this not a B. You've got to call it a what? You've got to call it a C flat and harmonic for B. So this right here, you've got to call it a C flat. Remember, no matter what flats, no matter what sharps, double flats, that numeric interval has got to be accurate. So if it says third, it's got to be a third. And then you just have to add whatever flats or whatever sharps you need to make it either the augmented or the minor or the diminished. Okay? I've focused a little bit on augmented and diminished. Let's just do a couple minors real quick before we tie this video up and you start doing your homework. So let's go from B flat and let's do a minor third up from B flat. So go ahead and pause and see if you can find the answer on your own and then come back and let's see if you got it right. Okay, I'm ready. So first, remember, I'm going to do my generic third, just stick it up there, and then I'm going to figure out what my major is. So what's my major third from B flat? And if you know your keys, you know that B flat has B flat and E flat, so you know that D's got nothing on there. But if you're not sure, remember, okay, a major third is whole step, figure that out, and the major is the plain old D. To make that minor, what you gonna do? Remember, minor is just a half step smaller. So all you gotta do, add a flat to that top note, and that is then minor. All right, so hopefully you understand how to do that. I wanna show you one more thing, which is this chart that's in your book on page 77. This chart is useful because it shows you the half steps that are in every single one of the intervals that we just did. And some of my students will memorize this or use it as a reference while you're doing your homework or whatever. So this shows you, now you'll notice that the top, I know you can't read this, but look at page 77 in your book while I'm talking to you guys. This shows you that a perfect unison or a diminished second has 0 half steps. Because a unison, it is the same note, it has 0 half steps. The next one is a minor second or augmented first. So those are the enharmonic intervals, and those both have just 1 half step in between the two. It then goes on all the way through the end, which is your perfect octave or augmented octave, and tells you how many intervals are in each, or how many half steps are in each interval. So all the way up, you can just use this as a reference. Now remember, if you're doing it with the half step method and you're going to count half steps to figure out your intervals, you've just got to make sure that you have, like I said earlier, that you've retained whether it's either a third or a fourth. Because when you're just counting half steps, like for instance, if I was starting on, I'll use E, and I wanted to do a major third. If I just looked at this chart and I went, okay, major third, here we go, 4 half steps. And I start on E and I go 1, 2, 3, 4. Awesome. That's an A flat. Okay? Technically on here, you're playing E. You're playing the right notes that would be played for a major third, but that is not a major third. You don't need an A flat on there. You need the G sharp on there. I hope you can read that. Okay, so again, if you use this chart, just make sure that your numeric interval or your generic interval is accurate. Go ahead and proceed on, do your homework, and please email me with questions. This chapter could be confusing, and I am here for you guys. Email me with questions or post on the question answer section of our discussion board.